Hello student, welcome to today's session of the course An Outline History of English Language and Literature. In continuation with the previous lecture, we begin looking at the age of Johnson, that is Samuel Johnson from 1745 to 1798. In his general prose, The Age of Johnson, we do not advance far into the history of the second half of 18th century before we become aware that profound changes are taking place in the spirit of English society. We have seen that in their moral reaction against the license which had followed by the Restoration, the men of Pope's time has settled down into formalism, taking as their guiding principle the rule of reason and good sense. So deeply had they come to distrust the emotions that the whole atmosphere of their lives and writing became hard and dry. Their dreads of earnestness and enthusiasm also gave a tone of flippancy and often a cynicism to their thoughts. Pope's ridiculous optimism expresses the easygoing mood of a self-complacent age. The kindly but thin superficial social criticism of Edison and Steele reveals the same temper in a different form, while the fierce misanthropy of Swift, striking a discordant note in is in part at least to be interpreted as the measureless scorn of the strong man for that petty world about him, which had none the less bound him down as his own Gulliver had been bound down by the Lilliputians. The new generation now in its turn reacted against the smug self-complacency and chilliness and ardity the preceding age. They found themselves discontent with the way in which their fathers had looked at life, with their formalism, their narrowness of sympathy, and their controlling ideals. Wearing off a long continued artificiality, they began to crave something more natural and spontaneous in thoughts and language. They awoke to a sense that in a world of wonder and mystery there were many things and dreams of in the shallow philosophy of the Augustan school. In particular, they were quickened into fresh activity by the renaissance of the feelings. This is perhaps beyond all others the one capital fact in the history of this period of transition. The emotions long repressed were now reinstated and our life was modified in consequence. We see this in the case of religion. In Pope's time, as we have noted, religion itself partaking of general tendencies of contemporary society had been formal, utilitarian and unspiritual. In the great evangelistic revival led by Wesley and Whitefield, the old formality was swept away, the utilitarianism abandoned, and a mighty tide of spiritual energy poured into the church and out among the masses of the people. The preachers of the last age, as we have said, has sought rather to convince by argument than to move by feeling, and their discourses had been carefully written essay, characterized by decorum, reserve, and a thorough recognition of the proprieties. The evangelists on the contrary made their appeal directly to the emotional nature and in extemporaneous discourses, and by their impassioned tones and gestures they showed that they cared nothing for decorum and the properties where the internal destiny of the soul was at stake. The immense success of Handel's Messiah on his first London performance in 1743 may be taken as another index of coming change. A natural accompaniment of this revival in religion was widening and deepening sympathy with man as man. The spirit of the humanitarian spirit and the increasing frequency and vigor of the protests which were now made not only against the brutality of society but also against its general colonies are historical as of much importance. But all these things were simply aspects of one great comprehensive movement, the rapid growth of democracy. More than ever before, the individual man was now recognized in his essential manhood, and the stress laid upon those qualities of character which have nothing to do with factitious associations of birth and breeding. As the century ran its course, social and political unrest became more and more marked. All sorts of new and explosive ideas filled the air. People became increasingly familiar with the notions of liberty, equality, and the right of man, and increasingly alive to the complex absurdities and evils of the existing social state. The passionate attacks of the great French writer Rousseau upon civilization and all its idols and his fairy gospel of back to nature sent a strange thrill through the whole European world. Turn where we may, in these closing decades of the century, signs of vast upheaval are apparent. Across the Atlantic, a new republic springs into being, the foundation principle of which is that men are born free and equal. Only a little later, the great storm which had long been gathering over France burst in the revolution that the literature of such a half-century will reveal in many ways. The conflict of all ideas anew, the steady triumphs of the new, and the profound changes of mood. Which resulted must of course be obvious. Looking at this literature from the more purely literary point of view, we may also expect to find that it exhibits a struggle between the powerful tradition of the Augustan age and various opposed theories, and with the gradual failure in prestige of the classic school, the establishment of a literature essentially different from this in respect alike of matter, spirit, and form. Though in the history of the literature of the age of Johnson, where there is much which at first sight seems confusing, we shall not, I think, find it difficult to mark out the main lines of its evolution. Johnson, the greatest Englishman of letters between Pope and Wordsworth, Samuel Johnson, was born at Lichfield in 1709. From his father, a bookseller, he inherited his huge and widely unhealthy frame and that will melancholy of disposition which was a thorough gloom over so much of his life. The elder Johnson died on the verge of bankruptcy. Samuel acted for a time as a school user. This translation for a Birmingham publishers married a widow 20 years his senior, and having sunk what little money she brought him in a futile attempt to establish a school of his own, resolved to try his fortunes in London. He reached the metropolis in 1737 with 2 pence halfpenny in his pocket, having as his companion one of his late pupils, David Garrick, presently to be famous as the greatest actor of his time. In 1738 he published a poem called London, and formed a connection with Caves magazine, to which for a number of years he regularly contributed to the parliamentary reports, though he himself was never in a gallery of the house, and merely worked up his debates from the notes of others. Amid much miscellaneous drudgery during the next years, he produced The Vanity of Human Wishes in 1749 and Tragedy Irony in 1737 on the new classic model, and in March 1750 started a periodic, The Rambler, in imitation of the Spectator, which appeared on Tuesday and Saturday till March 1752, all save 5 numbers being from his own pen. This was followed later by 2 other series, The Adventurer and The Idlers. Meanwhile, he was occupied for 8 years, 1747 to 1505, by an immense task, a dictionary of the English language, in which he undertook not only to define but also to illustrate his definition by quotation taking from the whole range of English literature. Though weak in etymology and philology, subjects which were then in their infancy, this work laid the foundation of English lexicography. Johnson's magnificent letter to Lord Casterfield, to whom he had addressed his prospectus, and who neglected him entirely till his labors were near completion, dealt the death blow to the whole 18th century system of patronage. The dictionary made him independent, and when somewhat later he received a pension of 300 a year, his struggles and anxieties were over. He now became the acknowledged dictator, or as Smollett called him, the great Cam of literature, and night by night in the famous club founded by him in 1764, and in which he sat surrounded by such men as Goldsmith, Sir Joshua Reynolds, the great painter Burke Gibbon, Sir William John, the Orientalist Garrick, and Boswell, he had ample opportunity for the exercise of his unmatched conversational and uncontroversial powers. He published his didactic tale Rasselas in 1759, an edition of Shakespeare in 1765, an account of his tour to the Hebrides, with Boswell under the title of Journey to the Western Island of Scotland in 1775, and his largest and also his greatest work, the lives of the most eminent English poet, with critical observations on their works in 1779 to 81. He died in 1784 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. In one particular the case, Johnson is peculiar, as Macaulay put it. The memory of other authors is kept alive by their works, but the memory of Johnson keeps many of his work alive. Though with one or two exceptions, his writings are today commonly neglected. No other English author is so intimately known to us. This is because he lives in the pages of his biography by his hero-worshipping friend James Boswell, the greatest book of the kind in our own or any other literature. Every detail of his oddly compounded but powerful personality is there portrayed for us. His countless eccentricities of behavior, his fits of moroseness and downright brutality, his tenderness and warmth of heart, his wonderful shrewdness and wisdom, his fine mental honesty and hatred of all forms of cant, his bigotry, intolerance and childish prejudices, his prodigious memory, his quickness of grasp and repartee, his extraordinary genius for talk. Though it may be admitted that Johnson owes his present fame mainly to Boswell, it is a mistake to ignore his own books, for he was a very great writer, though at each point we have to recognize his well-marked limitations. He was great both as a critic of literature and as a critic of life. As a critic of literature, he is almost always penetrating and stimulating, though he sometimes allowed his strong prejudices to interfere with his judgment, as when he failed to appreciate the value of Milton's poetry because of his antipathy of Milton's politics and religion. In all his tastes and standard, he was thoroughgoing conservative, holding fast to the principle of Augustan school of poetry and stoutly resisting every movement of revolt against what he regarded as the orthodox of literary creed. But to his matter we shall have to return later, when we shall also have something to say about the technical side of his own poetry. As a moralist, he is characterized by remarkable sanity and massive common sense. Broadly speaking, he is a pessimist. Life, he declared, is a progress from want to want, not from enjoyment to enjoyment. We are stirred into activity by feeling of its vacuity. We spend our energies for the most part in the pursuit of chemical pleasure, and when our desires are gratified, the usual result in satiety. He developed these views in many of his miscellaneous writing, and most notably in two of his finest works of Vanity of Human Wishes and Rasselas. The former The former is an impressive sermon on the text which is stated in the title and which is supported by a number of typical illustrations taken from history. The latter, which is historically significant as a reply to the filmy optimism of Shaftesbury and Pope, tells of a young Abyssinian prince who set out to discover the perfect way of life, and from his varied experiences among all kinds of people learns at length that the happiness which they all seek is now where to be found. But while the tone of Johnson's philosophy is thus profoundly sad, there is nothing debilitating about it. Throughout his life he made a most heroic fight against the besetting melancholy, which was one consequence of his chronic ill health, and the steady courage of his own manhood pervades his work. The essence of his teaching is that we should face the fact of existence honestly and not talk sentimental nonsense about them, while we bear the evil uncomplainingly and make the most we can of the good. Moreover, as the conclusion of the Vanity of Human Wishes and Rasselas shows, he was saved from the utter hopelessness by his strong religious faith. As a prose writer, Johnson did not follow the lead of the Augustan master, and in place of the easy grace of Addison and the vigorous idiomatic colloquialism of Swift, he gives us a style which is highly Latinized in vocabulary, and the sentence structure is marked by the elaborate valence and antithesis. Most readers now feel that his way of writing is pompous and heavy, but it is never obscure, and its base it has great strength, nobility and dignity. Goldsmith. In the literature of the Johnson era, the writer who stands nearest to Johnson himself both in personal and the historical interest is Oliver Goldsmith. The most eccentric of an eccentric family, Goldsmith was born in 1728 at Pallas, Longford, Ireland, where his father was a Protestant clergyman. In early life, he gained an unenviable reputation for wildness and stupidity, and after just contriving to take his degree at Dublin, he went some years in idleness before he was sent by his relative to Edinburgh to study medicine. From Edinburgh, where his bohemianism developed unchecked, he went to Leiden, and at Leiden, while nominally pursuing his medical studies, he earned a little money by teaching and lost it all at gaming tables. Then in 1755 he set out to make the grand tour of Europe with one clean shirt, a guinea in his pocket, and his favorite German flute as his equipment. He went through Flanders to Paris, thence to Switzerland, across the Alps, down into Italy as far as Padua, then celebrated for his medical school, and back through France. How he managed to pay his way is still something of a mystery, but for information regarding this question as well as details of his experience, it is probable that we are safe in turning to his poem, The Traveller, and to the account of George Primrose's continental wandering in the Vixar of Wakefield in 1756. He reached London penniless and friendless, and after acting for a time as an apothecary's assistant and as user in a Peckham school, he obtained an introduction to Richardson, became character for the press, and so at 30 drifted into literature. His career was mainly that of the hack writer, and the larger portion of his output belonged to the class of what are popularly known as pot boilers. Though even these have much of a charms of his personality and style, his most substantial work done meanwhile in the interval of drudgery consists of two poems, The Traveller and The Deserted Village, one novel, The Vixar of Wakefield, and two comedies, The Good-Natured Man and She Stoops to Conquer. To these should be added now a number of essays, including a series of entitled The Citizen of the World. His friendship with the Johnson dates from 1761 or even earlier, and he was one of the original members of the famous club. The warm relationship between the two men, so entirely different in the mind and temper, at so sympathetic, throws an interesting light on both. It is especially noteworthy that though Johnson often bullied Goldsmith, he would allow no one else to do so. And that it was Goldsmith who said about Johnson roughness of manner, and that there was nothing of the beer about him but his skin, shallow in conversation, with a perfect genius for blundering. Goldsmith was the laughing stock of the wit of London's literary world, but he was loved by such men as Burke and Reynolds. And Garrick, in a mock epitaph, said of him, "He wrote like an angel, even though he talked like poor Paul." His struggle and vicissitudes continued to the end of his life, and when he died in 1774, he was still deeply in debt. Poor Goldsmith was capricious, vain, and improvident, but he was so large-hearted, sympathetic, and human that we forget his faults and think of him always with the tenderest affection. As a man of letters, he was, in the words of Johnson's Latin epitaph in Westminster Abbey, a gentle master who left scarcely any kind of writing untouched, and touched nothing that he did not adorn. Goldsmith's work is very miscellaneous in character, and it is a matter of convenience only that we place him here among general prose. Of his one novel and of his poems we will speak elsewhere, but as the drama of Johnsonian age he is hardly important enough in the mass of merit. A separate section we may at once deal with his contribution to the literature of the stage. His two admirable comedies, and later of which still holds its own, an excellent acting play, are historical interesting because they mark a reaction against the dull and vapid moralizing of sentimental comedies, and a return to real humor and life. In this revival of the true comic speech, an equal part was played by Goldsmith's fellow countryman Richard Brinsley Sheridan, with his brilliant comedy The Rival and The School of Scandal. A striking features of Goldsmith's original writing. We must here distinguish between these and his mere compilations is a strong personal element in all of them. Their peculiar charm is more fundamentally the charm of the man himself. The most man he projected into what he wrote, not only his temperament but also his experiences, and a large portion of his imaginative work is really reminiscence, either as many passages in The Citizen of the World and Vicar of Wakefield under the thinnest possible disguise, or as in the case of his two great poems under no disguise at all. Thus it is easy to discover the originals of most of his best known characters in his relatives or himself. Dr. Primrose, for example, is certainly his father, the good priest in the deserted village, his brother Henry Moses in The Vicar of Wakefield, young Honeywood in The Good-Natured Man, and Tony Lupkin, the She Stoops to Conquer, humorous studies of himself as though he keeps so near to actual life. He is in no sense a realist. His temperament was, on the contrary, so essentially poetical, and everything he takes out of experience undergoes idealization of his hands. As a critic and theorist, he was, if possible, even more consistently conservative than Johnson, and stoutly maintained the supremacy of Pope. This fact will receive further emphasis presently in connection with his poetry. For the moment, we may in passing note that His admiration of the Augustan age was shown even in his prose style, influenced by the more elaborate rhetoric which Johnson had brought into vogue. He wrote in an easy, informal way, which, though of course entirely his own, may nonetheless be said to carry on the traditions of Addison and Stele. Other general prose writers of the period, some of the best prose work of Johnson's age was done in history, a field which was now indeed cultivated with greater success and in a more artistic spirit than ever before in England. David Hume, who is even better known as a Scapsial philosopher who wrote History of England, which is characterized by polished clearness of style but greatly marred by carelessness in regard to facts and by strong Tory bias in favor of the Stuarts and against the Puritans, following the lead of Voltaire. He combined with his political narrative much information concerning civilization and manners. William Robertson, a more careful if less brilliant writer, made a great mark with his History of Scotland, History of Charles V and History of America, but incomparably the greatest historian of the time was Edward Gibbon, whose History of Decline and Fall of Roman Empire remained one of the acknowledged masterpieces of historical literature. The original of his monumental work may be given in an author's own word. It was at Rome on the 15th October 1764, as I sat musing among the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted warriors were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and the fall of city first started to my mind. Gibbon's record begins with the reign of Titus AD 98 and closes with the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. He thus built a Rome road through 14th century. In the execution of his vast design, he united laborious research, painstaking accuracy, and the most wonderful power of organizing enormous and chaotic masses of material into a well-watered whole. The only serious faults which can be found with him are that he lacks feeling and sympathy, that he deals inadequately with the religious aspect of his subject and especially with the whole question of Christianity, and that his style is too monotonously labored and grandiose. But as a recognized authority, the late E.A. Freeman said Gibbon remains the one historian of the 18th century whom modern research has neither set aside nor threatened to set aside. As Gibbon is the great name in the historical prose of the period, so its great name in political prose is that of Edmund Burke. A man of noble nature and extraordinary breadth of outlook, Burke carried into a political controversy passionate moral earnestness, vivid imagination, and splendid logical powers. While his rich and highly wrought rhetoric style gave a gorgeous coloring to everything he wrote, his principles were those of philosophic conservatism, and profound sense of historical continuity was one of the central elements of his thought. He supported the cause of the American colonies in his speeches on American taxation and on conciliation with America, and bitterly opposed the French Revolution in his reflection, letter to a noble lord and letters on a regicide peace. The first of these was answered by Thomas Paine in his Right of Man, but the thought on the present discontent may perhaps be regarded as the most permanently interesting of Burke's political writing. His early inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful is the first important English treatise on aesthetic. Burke was also at one time suspected of writing the 70 letters filled with fierce invective against the government, which appeared between 1768 and 1772 over the signature Junius, and which, though the mystery of their authorship has been completely cleared up are now generally attributed to Sir Philip Francis. If Burke was the great English representative of conservative attitude toward the French Revolution, its most conspicuous philosophy supporter was William Godwin, whose inquiry concerning political justice, setting forth the most extreme revolutionary ideas of all calmness of a mathematical demonstration, exercised, as we shall see later, an enormous influence upon the younger generation. During Johnson's age, there was also great activity in the literature of theology, philosophy, and political economy, but the work done in this field was too special in character to be included here. In lighter prose, the most important names are those of the later writers, for the later writing was at this time assiduously cultivated both as a pastime and as an art. Of these three call for mention Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, Philip Dormer Stanhope, Earl of Chesterfield, and Horace Walpole. The latter of Lady Mary cover a period of nearly half a century and are almost equally readable throughout, but they are perhaps particularly interesting when they deal in the author's characteristically vivacious way with her varied experiences abroad. Those of Chesterfield, addressed to his son, were intended as a manual in polite behavior for a young man's guidance, and their tone is that of the typical man of the world. Those of Walpole are exceedingly amusing, a living chronicle of social doings, political personalities, scandals, and small talk in the charmed circle in which that dilettante trifler played his part, but their flippancy, their triviality of style, and their frequent spitefulness gives us a rather poor impression of his character. His name will come up again presently in connection with the novel. So with this we begin to wind up today's lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to see you in next class. Thank you, that's all. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe.